everybody for joining us tonight. My name is Steve Roach Knight. I am a co-founder and board member for Transform Network, which is one of the partners in this live stream this evening, talking about the Portland protests with faith leaders on the front lines of our nation's slide towards fascism. And if you are like me, you have probably been seeing things in the news, seeing a lot of headlines, and not really sure what has actually been happening in Portland, or certainly not all of the stories have been told. And so I'm really grateful for this amazing group of BIPOC leaders who have been active in the community for coming on tonight and having this conversation to help tell the stories of what's really been going on, what we can learn, recognizing that the types of things that have been happening in Portland, not just over the last few weeks or certainly the last few months, but for a long time, have also been happening in our cities, and what we as faith leaders, as people of faith, can do and do now to prepare and know how to respond in a faithful way that is going to help people move towards justice, love and justice. So without further ado, I just want to invite this amazing panel, if they would, to just introduce themselves briefly and tell us who they are and kind of your communities and your points of connection. And if it's okay, Lenny, we'll just start with you.
I'm the Reverend Lenny Duncan, and I serve in Vancouver, Washington, just right over the river from Portland, Oregon, for a community called Jubilee Collective. And I am currently a member of the BIPOC Faith Leaders Council for Black Lives, and I come to you in that capacity this evening. Oh, and my pronouns are he, him, and his.
That's great. Thanks, Lenny.
And I'll invite Alide.
Thanks, Lenny. Hi, everybody. My name is Alaide Vilchis Ibarra, and I'm the executive director of an organization called the Interfaith Movement for Immigrant Justice, or EMERGE. And we're an organization of faith communities across Oregon that organizes for immigrant justice and racial justice. And I am also part of the BIPOC Faith Leaders Council for Black Lives as well. And maybe I'll invite Lavita. Why don't you go next?
Hi, thank you, Alaide. Hello, everyone. I'm Lavita Gilmore-Jones, and I am the co-director and organizer with Levin Community, Salt and Light Lutheran Church here in Portland, Oregon. And Levin Community is a community that creates space for people to be and love and act together based out of our shared stories and acting together through relational community organizing. And so I would like to invite Bill.
Thank you, Lavita. I'm Reverend Bill Sinkford. I'm the senior minister at the First Unitarian Church of Portland. First Unitarian is my pronouns are he, him, and his. First Unitarian is a downtown church. We're just blocks from the center of the protest in the downtown. And the community that I serve includes folks who have been very active in the protests and many who come into the church from suburban areas. So I minister to the range of folks, and I'm very glad to be here. I also am here in my capacity as a member of the BIPOC Faith Leaders Group. And I'll invite Rabbi Benjamin to introduce himself now.
Thanks, Bill. I'm Benjamin Barnett. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the rabbi of Chavra Shalom here in Portland. I'm not a BIPOC individual. It's an honor to be asked to be part of this conversation with these amazing leaders, and I'm just showing up as I can amidst this movement for Black lives and in opposition to police violence.
Yeah, thank you all for being here. I'm also use he, him, his pronouns as well. I am based here in North Carolina, and as there are folks, hundreds of folks online with us from all across the country, we've been hearing about Portland in the news most recently, and we know we're not hearing the whole story. And I would just love to invite y'all to tell us what's really been happening. What have you seen? What has your experience been? And what's the real story? What should we know about what's been happening there?
I think I'll start. In broad terms, what you're seeing is state violence in response to the cry Black Lives Matter. In even broader terms, you're seeing fascism as a result of state violence to the cry Black Lives Matter. An even higher view of that is you're seeing perhaps, and I want to say this as calmly as I can, we're perhaps seeing the principles of the Republic being tested in a way that is completely unprecedented. What occurs to me, and I'll talk a little bit specific about some of the things I've seen in a second, what occurs to me is that something I've been saying since the beginning is that Black people have been the canary in the coal mine for freedom in this republic for over 400 years. And what they do to us in the daylight, they will do to you in the dark. Well, those phrasings or those sayings that you've heard so much of, this is the time. It's here and it's now. So what have I seen? I've seen normal everyday doctors, taxi drivers, people who work at Safeway, and 7-Eleven workers have to put on body armor to protect them from the Portland Police Bureau. I have seen these everyday people start out just with signs and then get gas, so they show up with gas masks. I've seen the gas be added, rubber bullets are added to it. And then once the rubber bullets come, they start wearing body armor. And now they're showing up with gas masks and helmets. These are everyday normal citizens, right? People are constantly critiquing what they're seeing on the ground in Portland. And I'm willing to make the bet these are perhaps the best white people I've ever seen in my life. They come home from work, put on body armor after they drop off their kids, because every time they say Black Lives Matter in Portland, there is tear gas, there is systemic violence, there are arrests. We have seen ACLU observers be targeted. We have seen witnesses be targeted. We have seen medics be targeted. We have seen just everyday citizens be targeted. And not only that, but once the feds got involved, and I know Alade will speak more to this, it's the same thing our siblings to the south saw. We're seeing Border Patrol test fascist tactics in real time. And it's no mistake it's happening in the whitest, most progressive city in America. It's because there's so few of us here. It's easy to test the waters with our blood and our lives. And the people of Portland have stood up. I've never been prouder to move to a city in my damn life. They have stood up every day. These are not violent terrorists. These are everyday people who come home from a shift at work and have to put on body armor. You know, there are rabbis I know who have handed me gas masks. Dig the optic for a second here. You have a Jewish person willingly being gassed to protect a black body on the streets of America, and no one is sounding the alarm. Rabbi Benjamin has a much firmer witness there, because my response to black trauma and my anxiety and what it takes for me to get out in the streets means that I am not out there as much as some people, but I am out there fairly consistently. And so I would like to invite Rabbi Benjamin to talk a little bit about what he's seen, since I talked about it in like a broader kind of spectrum.
Amen. Thank you, Lenny. Well, maybe I'll start with this, this word that we've used a lot among faith leaders who have been gathering, convening out there and supporting each other, is this word witness, that we see ourselves as clergy witness, and we wear many of us purple vests that say clergy witness on them And we see ourselves as bearing witness. And just that practice of what does that mean? What are we bearing witness to? And I think a couple things that I'd like to just talk about in that. One is to be a loving witness as part of and alongside and in kinship with those who are opposing state violence, and to be a witness for truth in the presence of state violence. And I think for me, that's been just on a personal level, feels like one of the most powerful aspects of this, and where I feel called into, is to be a firsthand witness for truth. And what I mean by that is, I've been out there on many nights and I see things happen, and then I see or I hear how it's represented the next morning, either from the mainstream media or from the Portland Police Bureau, and it just does not reflect what I saw. That unlawful assemblies are declared and riots are declared, and this word violence, which I hope we get to talk about more, what we mean when we say violence, violent protesters. And I think we need to really name that. And what do we mean when we say violence? Because what I'm experiencing is not violence from the protesters. I'm experiencing violence from the police, indiscriminate. All the things that Lenny was talking about, tear gas and munitions, all kinds of impact munitions to disperse crowds. And this witnessing to truth and to the violation of truth, for me, has felt in these very particular ways connected with the more witnessing to a more entrenched and systemic and generational violations of truth. The fundamental lies that this nation was founded upon and is sustained through, denying dignity and protection and just humanity to Black people and Indigenous people and people of color. And so I guess for me, just as a faith leader, and naming that feels like an important piece of this practice here, is that we are witnessing to truth, both in the particular and in this fuller spectrum of what it means to bear witness to truth and bear witness in opposition to falsehood. And maybe I'll just say the last piece I want to say is as a white person, someone who's lived with the benefits of whiteness throughout my life in ways that I didn't know growing up and have learned throughout my adult life, that also feels intimately connected to encountering the hard truths within myself and within the world that I live in that I take for granted. And I think that's, God willing, a part of this movement as well. Those great white people that Lenny's talking about, God willing, that's true. We can live up to that. We can actually encounter the hard truths within ourselves and within our families and communities that we need to, as part of also in coordination with the truths that we are bearing witness to on the streets.
I think, Benjamin, picking up on what you were saying about truth and witness and justice and what that looks like, I just see, as I was like thinking about what to say or what I would want people to know, I just see so much of the truth being central, not just as a faithful practice, as you so beautiful put it, but also as a scene of what is actually happening, and also as a strategy to counter what isn't happening that people say it's happening every day, right? Like as a person who often accompanies the clergy that are there, I have to wear whatever I need to protect myself, right? Like it doesn't matter that I'm standing back. It doesn't matter that I would never do anything. Part of it is because I'm vulnerable. I'm an immigrant, right? And like that means something, right? That does not matter. Like if you're there, if you're downtown, you're speaking about policing in the United States, speaking about centering Black lives, and what that means is that you're going to see violence upon you, if you're standing there, right? Like that's what's going to happen. And I just think about how, like, to some degree, unequipped for that, like how quickly the conversation has shifted, even within Oregon sometimes, like even within Portland, instead of centering Black lives and justice, it's like centering the conversation around violence, right? Like, are people violent? Are people not? And to me, I'm like, yeah, this is it's a conversation about tactics versus justice, like versus the call to justice of every person of faith, of being like, what do you want to center here? And I'm not saying that those conversations are not valid. I'm not saying that we need to dig deeper and do our work, like to see what tactics we're comfortable with, what we aren't. I'm not saying that at all. But when we are, like, when we're not there, when we're not centering Black lives in the conversation, in everything that we do, in the work every single day, when we're not centering justice in that way, then then what are we doing? Like, if most of my conversations are about whether somebody should be throwing something or not, and not about policing in the United States that was born specifically as a racist system and that continues to be, then what are, you know, then how are we doing that? Like, how is the spirit of what happened 3 months ago and all those commitments that we made 3 months ago, right, when people began this, like, how is that alive today if we're not centering that? And I fear that it's not only like spiritually seems like a hard thing, but it's also politically, like, as somebody who has done policy before, it's like anytime you're moving the center of the conversation to something different, away from Black lives, then you're building the narrative that okay, people are violent, then we need more violence, right? And we need to escalate. And that is why you see the federal presence here, right? Because some of our leaders, I think, well meaning and speaking their truth, sometimes have like built that narrative as well, and it's been hard. And I mean leaders across the board. And so I think as faith leaders, or as leaders in the faith space, just like being able to do some real wrestling with that and discernment around that, that I think we can do to be a bit more complex about it. Like, what does that look like? What does it feel like to do that?
Yeah.
I agree. And I was also thinking, you know, as you all were talking about violence, there was Dr. King back in 1967 in his speech on The Other America was referring to riots, and in paraphrasing something, he said, you know, violence does not materialize out of thin air. And I think that we keep forgetting that at the root of violence, there is a racist neo-plantation system that we are living in right now, where wealth and power is accrued through the commodification and the exploitation of the land, of resources and people. And this system is grounded in racism, and it's grounded in violence. So the outcome of that is going to be violence. And the policing system in America, Alaide, as you know, referenced, is designed basically to protect this neo-plantation system. That's how this policing is designed. And so this is not only making policing, the system of policing, dangerous for Black and Brown and Indigenous people, but it's also making it dangerous for the police officers. And I think that, you know, we have to ask ourselves, America has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. And it has failed to hear that a large segment of our society is more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity. And so as faith leaders, you know, that last quote was from Dr. King's speech. As faith leaders, we need to name the truth. What is this system rooted and grounded in? And then we can ask ourselves the questions, what do we truly value? Who do we truly value? You know, who are we paying attention to? Whose voices are we listening to? Whose voices are missing? And who are we really trying to be accountable to? And then, you know, our imagination is, what do we want this beloved community to be? You know, we really have to get serious about it. If we say we value something, but our lives don't live out that, we value what we're living. We don't value what we say. We value what we're doing and being. So I think that's a challenge for us.
I don't think we're going to improve on your analysis, Levita. I think the comments that I want to make have to do with, well, I'm going to start with the wonderful people that Lenny described, the wonderful white people of Portland. You know, 90 days ago, there was an uprising on the streets here, like there was in almost every one of the cities of the United States. Mixed race, but primarily in Portland, primarily white folks who were willing to stand up for Black Lives Matter and for the movement for Black lives. The thing that you need to know if you're not from Portland is how rapidly the conversation got diverted from the need to support Black Lives Matter to the conversation about violence and its dangers. The community of well-intended, progressive white folks had a very hard time holding on to that central need and the central demand to, we talk about defunding police here. What we're really talking about is a radical reallocation of resources and a repurposing of our public safety officials and a reallocation of resources into the thriving of the communities of color rather than into their policing. And as the violence has gotten such play, not just nationally, it gets play here. Communities that include both those who are going down every night and those who go into the suburbs every night have to try to retain that focus so that we don't lose sight of what the goal is. And the church that I serve includes both those kinds of folks. And I spend a great deal of my time trying to help those who are deeply privileged remember that the goal here was the support for Black lives, and to remember their commitment and to ask them to be faithful to it rather than to be fearful of it.
That is so good. I think we have seen this same story played out over and over again. I know I was a part of the Charlotte uprising here in North Carolina a few years ago, and very similar. The media likes to focus on the sensational, and there's something about, several of you brought up this topic of violence, and what I'm hearing you all say, and I just want to tease this out a little bit more, is there is a particular kind of violence that has been going on in Portland, in all of our cities for a long, long time, and that is police brutality and over policing and racist policing, and but that's not what you're talking about when you talk about the narrative shifting to violence. You're talking, the narrative shifts to quote unquote looting and this type of thing. But talk a little bit more about the violence that that started all of this, and the what's really been going on. I'll just say, it can sometimes be difficult to sort of understand what's happening. I thought Portland had a really progressive mayor, but the people in Portland seem to be really upset with him. But he's anti-Trump, so he's a good guy, right? Like, help us understand what you all are seeing in those dynamics.
It's really interesting, right? It's hard to talk about the compounded violence that a Black person experiences on a day-to-day, like, just a walk, right? And then you compound that with these historical narratives that, like, I'm formerly incarcerated, I spent time in jail, I was locked up. The last time I was at the Justice Center in Portland, I was locked up for enough marijuana that wouldn't even fit in a roach. Now white people in Portland are living high on the hog off of marijuana sales, right? But the last time I was in the Justice Center, I was in cuffs because I was homeless and I asked someone for change. And one of these progressive white people didn't like that, called the police, cop searches me, I've got a dime bag, of weed on me, they take me, I can't afford bail. Are you hearing the story yet? Because this is why people are pissed off in Portland, right? This happened to me 20 years ago, right? I get arrested and I get let out with nothing, right? And then I get told, and this is a true story, I get told that I have 30 days to do what I've never been able to do, and that's become a citizen, right? And do the next right thing. Instead, what happens is for 20 years, I have a warrant floating over my head till I move back to Portland and hire a lawyer to deal with it. And these are the same people who want to talk to me about the violence of the protesters. These are the same people who want to, do this narrative about the tactics of the people on the ground. What I've witnessed is nothing but police violence, police escalating the violence, declaring riots when there weren't riots. All of that stuff was happening the entire time. And the reason it happened in a very progressive place is because particularly progressive faith people, really believe that they know what's going on the ground constantly, and they have no idea. Most of the time they're so out of touch with the Black community and our cries and our needs and our real issues that when something happens they act surprised. And the narrative of violence is the same system of violence that's been used against me since they dropped bombs on my neighborhood in 63rd and Race and they burned down the entire neighborhood, right? Trying to get to move, right? Free Mamiya Abdul-Jamal, free them all. You know what I mean? Like this narrative of violence, how am I supposed to respond? What am I supposed to do? I begged, I borrowed, I stealed, I pleaded, I prayed. We gave you the best of us. We gave you Martin. He dressed to the nines. You murdered him. We gave you Malcolm. You took our manhood. What else do you want from us? And now you're mad because you murdered a young girl in her home? And another cop stood there with his hand in his pocket, with his knee on his neck, while he cried for his mama? And 100 days later, you want me to critique some anarchist? The violence we see is state violence perpetuated by the state. They instigate the violence. They set the protesters up, and they constantly put them in situations so they can get these 30-second clips for KLIN and run this narrative that you shouldn't stand up for Black lives. It's to convince good people, like the people who are watching right now, not to stand up. It is as old as time in this country. It is not new information that you should not trust the government or the media when the people are rising up. We know this. And so we're here today just to tell you that the violence isn't on the protesters' side. It's completely on the side of the state. It's completely on the side of the police, because that's the entire system they're entrenched with. That's all they can do is violence. That's all they know is violence. That's all they taught me was violence. And now you're mad because I live in the system you presented to me. Now you're mad. Sorry. Just every time I hear that violence thing, it infuriates me. And yeah, are some of the groups and tactics and some of the stuff happening on the ground confusing, and some people don't know what's going on, and sometimes it seems like one group's against another group, and we're not sure, and who do you follow? And yes, that's called organizing. Remember? It's how it always is. Sorry, I'll shut up now and move on.
Preach, preacher.
I think one of the many themes that Lenny started to hold up and held up so well is about history and how history comes forward. History is not the past. History is actually the present. And if we don't make some structural changes, history will be the future too. Folks outside Oregon may not know that Oregon, when it was admitted to the Union, put into its constitution that it was illegal to be Black in Oregon. There was actually a lash law that was on the books. I think it was not taken off the books until 1990s, that if you were found to be Black in Oregon, you were to be lashed. Now, it wasn't much used, but is it any surprise that Oregon is one of the whitest states in the United States? And is it any surprise that the communities of color in Oregon have always been living in a police state? It simply should not be a surprise. And the call for Black Lives Matter is a call to take this, what may be an opening, what may be an opportunity, to finally make some changes in that fact. The other thing that I wanted to say is that Portland and Oregon is a progressive place. And progressive places often are attached to any number of important priorities. They're important to racial justice. They're also attached to climate change, and they're attached to animal rights. And the danger here is that too many folks can see the movement for Black lives as one among many nice progressive priorities, rather than as a central sin, if you will, in our society, which cuts across all of the others. And until that sin is addressed, until we manage to find collectively some opportunity for confession and ultimately for some redemption, it will pollute the body politic. We need to do it first.
And maybe
Bill,
I'll go, Levita. Go.
I'm sorry, Bill, I appreciate you talking about history. You know, I was born here in Portland, raised in Portland, the Portland area. I spent, you know, maybe 4 or 5 years not living in the city itself, you know, during the 90s. But for the most part, my life has been here. And we don't talk about, you know, there was a window of time when Black Americans living in the city of Portland, you know, we were in a neighborhood, we had a place that was our hood. But the irony of that is it was our place because of the redlining, and because that was the only places where we could live. But there was vibrant community. And then the same thing that has happened throughout the whole United States is, you know, by disinvesting in the community, by removing the programs that give people opportunity to learn and to grow and to be healthy, to have a decent paying job, by removing that funding, the economic funding, the supports, the mental health services, by removing those things out of the community, and then saying, well, look, they're not you know, look at them, and then by the big banks coming in and buying up the land, and then turning around and holding on to it, and then selling it and commodifying the land, and then all of a sudden this community of people becomes displaced. And that's what's happened in this community. We had a place, even though it came out of redlining, we had a place where where there was a sense of home. And now the Black and Indigenous and people of color in this city have been scattered to the winds. There's still a small group, but for the most part, everyone is scattered to the winds. And so this is not only happening here in Portland, it's happening other places. And I think part of the conversation is, how do we center the voices of Black and Indigenous people and people of color? How do we center our voices? How do Black lives matter when it's hard, when we're in different places? And I think that that's something that our faith leaders need to also, our Black faith leaders need to get serious about and talk about and come together around and build community, no matter where we're located, because it can't be tied to a neighborhood. It has to now be tied to people and relationships. And we have to grow our people, grow our relationships with one another, and then use that power in order to enact the changes and to demand the changes and to say, we will not go away until these changes happen.
Amen.
it strikes me, Lavita, as you're mentioning that, how much, and actually Lenny, when you began speaking, how much what we're saying, and I can relate to this. I'm an ally. I'm a Mexican immigrant, but I can relate to this. How much like it hurts personally, and maybe this is a bit vulnerable, but it's true. Like I'll be vulnerable about this. Like it hurts personally when somebody puts the violence, quote unquote, or the tactics of like people who are trying to shine a line to policing versus the violence, like the systemic violence, like the displacement of Black communities in Portland, like you spoke about, or the ways in which the system treated you, Lenny, like we all spoke about. And for me, it's like the way that the immigration system robbed me of so many things, like so many things, you know, years with family growing up, like the ways that system has been violent towards me. And it hurts when people put such a weight in one, and they fail to see our stories of like within us, like how we individually are deeply hurt by the ways in which the system has done violence upon us. And I think part of that is also that it's meant to be invisible, right? Like all of those pains are pains we carry, and sometimes we don't talk about with everyone because they're not safe to talk about with everyone. And I just like I like why aren't all faith leaders and or people of faith getting closer to that, right? Like I think all of the faith texts ask you to do that, to get closer to that, right? To live up to the person that you should be, so you that deserve to hear some of those painful stories. And I think about that specifically around immigration too, right? Like the way in which the federal forces showed up here in Bend, in Oregon, and in Bend also too, actually. But Border Patrol was showing up, and like it became this huge deal. Like people were outraged that that Border Patrol was here, and the special unit tactics that, by the way, also gets a ton of money from our taxes every single day, was coming here and grabbing protesters and putting them in unmarked vans, right? But that thing has been happening to immigrant communities at the border for years, and they've been trying to tell their story for years with so many people listening. So what does it look like when we get closer to that? And how does that shift the way that we show up into spaces and the way that we act as communities together, right? And it just strikes me how much like it's personal to us too. It's not just a conversation about this thing that's happening here. It's like of all the stories that have happened to us in our bodies, and that we're still trying to like still live in this world with those ones of the system.
No, I mean that's it, right? Like it's hard for me to talk about this stuff because like half the time my partner has to put me back together after going out in the streets, right? And like you know, and then like once I'm like together enough, like after she like loves on me and like heals on me and like my family comes around me, right? I got just enough strength to go back out there again. And then I experience state violence again. I bear witness to it, and then it all starts again. And you're right. I mean, for me, it's not an abstract idea. It's the fight for my life. And so it feels very different. I think that's a really good point. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you, Elida.
I just want to speak to, you know, I think part of the question that you asked, Steve, that relates is sort of, well, what about Portland? Isn't that a progressive place? And, you know, what's happening there? And doesn't, you know, the mayor hates Trump and, you know, et cetera. And I feel like it connects to everything, just these powerful illustrations of violence that you all are sharing, generational violence and violence against communities and peoples. And I think there's a way in which, one of the things I think, just to share, that I think has been done well, at least among the core of protesters and other leaders here in town, is to keep the focus locally as much as possible, and to not sort of sidestep this and make it all about the feds and all about Trump, and not to say that we shouldn't be opposing the presence of federal agents and obviously opposing Trump, but you know, there's a way in which local leaders, you know, our mayor and others get to sort of stand up and, you know, oppose that, and yet, you know, not take responsibility for these kinds of this, like what Lavita is describing, this kind of, you know, local generational violence that has ravaged communities and continues to enact violence in so many ways. Housing and health outcomes and education and wealth. And so I think that is something I think that has been done well in certain ways here in Portland. And I think that is something to take with to focus. There have been fights going on. I mean, a fight going on, a movement going on for decades for police accountability here. And those need to remain strong and be ramped up here now more than ever, about the PPB being held accountable, the Portland Police Bureau being held accountable for what they're doing, which I just have to name is by and large very similar to what federal agents have done on the street here. And I know it's maybe bigger and scarier, or there are things that are different about what the federal agents have done when they've come, but it's a difference in degree, not a difference in kind from what the Portland Police Bureau has done in these protests, and I think does in general. That's what policing, I think, that's the system of policing.
I see a question in our chat box that basically talks about, I'm used to thinking in terms of public policy let me see. Do we think that we will create the systemic changes from the street? I'm used to thinking in terms of public policy. Is that behind us?
Yes.
I have something to say about it.
Yes,
But let me go first.
Elide, go ahead. Oh, okay.
I was just going to say there's a huge history of this, right? Why do children get breakfast in the morning? Because the Black Panthers showed up and fed kids.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Why was there ever a consent decree from the mighty Obama who came down from his drone throne just long enough to notice that Black people were dying in his great racially equalized America? Because people in Ferguson stood up. Why is Frank Rizzo's racist statue tore down from the city hall of my hometown in Philadelphia? Because people stood up. Why can women vote in this country? Because people stood up. Why can I vote? Because someone walked across a bridge in the face of state violence. That this idea that you think they're never, Frederick Douglass, power never cedes nothing without demand. It never has and it never will. You know, here's an interesting fact if you want to think about why there's so much unrest in the country. Do you know the last time there was this much wealth inequality in America? 1774. None of this is happening by mistake or in a vacuum, you know? But I'll let Elide speak. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. My background is in public policy. I used to work in Washington, D.C. doing immigration advocacy policy work. So public policy is very much in my heart. And I don't think that it's either or necessarily. Like today, there was a hearing of some bills around policing at the state capitol today, this morning, afternoon in Portland. And I just do not think that we would be there if it wasn't that there are people on the streets every single day demanding change, and they will until there's something that happens. And when they demand change, they also know that it isn't just little tweaks to a system. They want to see systemic change, and they want to see the beginnings of that. And I do think that they're not either or. I think maybe individually we may find our place in different spaces, but we better be thankful and grateful that every other person is doing work in every other space around this and building relationship and doing the organizing and showing up in the streets. Personally, a practice for my own, anything that I do in policy is to show up. I am on the streets. I go witness with clergy. I've been with Benjamin, have had the pleasure of having gas masks together. And it is, I have to witness that to be able to remind myself that systemic change needs to happen and that it cannot wait. We cannot wait for that we need to be serious about it. We really do. And every one of us should be serious about it.
So I think just to build on what you said, Elide, public policy is actually central. What we're talking about is structural change in public, expressed through public policy. So I don't think, at least I don't deny the importance of public policy at all. That's what we want changed. The question is, how do you drive change in public policy that is authentic and real and grounded in the real lived experience of the people. That's the question. And that's the role of the protests, I'm absolutely certain. Because we would not be having as authentic conversations as we're having, and they're not truly authentic yet, absent 90 days of street protest. Simply would not be taking place. The system will protect itself. The system is extremely skilled at preserving the existing power relationships.
Beautiful. There's a question about, maybe Levita, you want to take this as you, I think, spoke really well to it. Could you elaborate what it's meant by generational violence? What does that mean?
Generational violence. When I was born in the 1950s, as I said, there was community that was strategically located in one part of the city because that's where we were allowed to live. And then in the 60s, we were allowed to move up to the next sector of the city, and in the 70s to the next sector of the city, all right? And during that time, there was some wealth that was starting to be built with people being able to own our homes and go to school and start to get college education. And the government also, you know, in the late 60s created something like the Model Cities programs and other kind of programs to help make that happen. And then as the monies were pulled back and as the system, as you so well said, Bill, began to protect itself, I saw that the system didn't keep out drugs. The system allowed all kind of drugs to come into the community. It wasn't the people who were on the street selling, because it was our system, our government, that allowed this to come into the neighborhoods and taking away employment from people, not having programs where youth could do anything in the summer. There was and then you have the policing that's in place. The policing now that's in place to make sure that the bad people are going to jail, and all of a sudden you have families that are torn apart. Excuse me. You have examples of people who are going away to school. I mean, that whole generation is lost, and now I know people who have had generational poverty in their families. I mean, it's just like from one generation to the other. What does it take if I have a young woman who is who was going to school and she had to drop out of school, and then she had children, and then her children go to school, but she can't help them with their homework, and she's calling someone to come help them with their homework, and then the kids get disenfranchised and they get disappointed and they drop out of school. That is one side of the story. It's just one side of the story. I have to say that African American people in this country, we are resilient and we don't stay stuck and we're not victims. But the generational piece is like, it started with the grandmother, it continues to the mother, and it continues to the child. And what are we putting in place so that we can get out of this cycle? What do we want to put in place? What are we committed to putting in place to getting out of the cycle? I don't know if this is a good explanation of generational violence, whatever the question was, but I've just seen it.
This is another question that I would love to hear y'all give a response to. Michelle asks, what prevents more churches, mosques, synagogues, etc., from helping and marching in the streets? Is it money? What do y'all think?
I have a lot of theories on this. I think the first thing is that we need to understand that Black Lives Matter. The reason why faith groups have struggled to attach to Black Lives Matter is because it was started by 3 queer Black women. So it was not cis male straight leadership. So the church ignored it for a long time, particularly the Black church. I can say that as a Black man, particularly the Black church. They ignored the cries of these young women on the streets when Trayvon passed, was murdered, massacred by a guy who sells Skittles bags that he tags for money now. Right? America defended this guy to the nines, right? And they're right. So my point is, my point with all that is that, you know, it's all products of white supremacy. Queerphobia, transphobia, cis heteropatriarchy are all things that have been taught to us by white supremacy. And what you're seeing right now in America is the death gasp of white supremacy. The problem when a cornered predator is dying is that it's particularly dangerous. And so you see these overt expressions, right? So because it wasn't centered in the way that we recognize Black leadership with a falsetto and a high voice and a preacher just standing in front of you, we didn't listen. And we were caught flat-footed. And by the time Michael Brown died, the church was so far behind the game, mosques were so far behind the game, shuls didn't know what was going on. I was walking around the church begging people for Black lives, begging church leaders. And I'm just going to be honest because this is my commitment. I don't care if they ever defraud me in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. Not one bishop offered to send me gas masks, ballistic vests, nothing. Except my local bishop who just called to see if I was okay, which I totally respect. Right? But like, you know, like our national bishop didn't even say, hey man, what can I do? Right? Because the church is not equipped to face the reality of what's happening here. That America is going to pay for its original sin, come hook or crook. And you might pay for it by having a fascist overt regime built in whiteness and white supremacy, or you might pay for it because your damn CVS burns down. But either way, the bill is coming due. And so, from my perspective, that's why faith leaders have so much trouble. For me as a Christian, if you can't hear the cries of Jesus Christ on the streets of America right now, if you can't figure out that the hero of your story was killed by the state, then I really don't have a lot of time to explain it to you anymore. Because we're dying out here. And I know I sound alarmist and crazy, but you'll sound just like me. One thing I can promise you is I always sound crazy until 6 weeks later. Almost exactly 6 weeks. And then it's going to come to a town near you, and then you're going to say, man, I should have listened. But I'll let someone else speak on that.
I mean, I don't know, Benjamin, maybe you have something, but I've seen just like people are afraid to wrestle with really hard conversations. They're just scared. And it's so funny because isn't a church or spaces of faith supposed to be where we have those tough conversations? Aren't we talking about life, death, and like finding meaning behind it? How is it that it is so hard to begin moving? I think one of the things that we're finding as we're organizing and working with communities at Emerge is just how much people are terrified to begin to do the work in the first place, to just show up. Like sometimes you don't have all the answers. You don't know. I saw somebody asking, how do we look at the issues and take a stand against destruction? Like you begin by acting on the issues and then struggling through why you're having the feelings. What does that mean? How does it relate to other people? What does it look like, right? So that is how you begin, but you have to start somewhere and you have to show up and you have to do that. And I just see so many people in churches and in faith communities terrified to begin, sometimes because they think, okay, I may say something wrong and then I showed up in the wrong way and then forget it. Sometimes because they're not sure exactly where. But I think once again, like if we don't begin to just act and begin to build those relationships with the right people and listen to those stories and act and sometimes make mistakes and act and sometimes look silly, and show up and sometimes, you know, realize that wasn't the way, then we're not gonna get anywhere. You know, I think that just fear of that and the idea that either you are 100% or you're 0%, but like there's nuance in there. That's just not true. And things that there's urgency. Things are important. We need to do that work now. We need to learn to do that. And I will say, especially to communities that are not Black communities, to begin to show up however we can for Black lives.
Amen. Amen. Yeah.
The church that I serve is predominantly white. And I think one of the real challenges that the churches like mine, that my church and churches like mine face, is trying to move through the notion of individual innocence into a kind of collective accountability and a collective responsibility. It is. I've been dealing with this for a long time in my life, and it still is amazing to me how attached people are to the desire to see themselves as somehow innocent and pure, when the truth is that religious communities, almost all of them, understand that we are fallible, that we make mistakes. Some call it sin, pick your language. But religions know about the fallibility of the human species. And yet it is that desire for innocence, which I think causes so much resistance, at least in the folks that and I know it even in myself. So I don't want to just externalize this.
Yeah. Imagine if we just admitted we're all imperfect, Bill. What would that look like?
I know.
And we still can want justice. I don't know if that's a sentence.
Yes.
At the center of it, right? And if we just acknowledge that fact.
Yeah.
I think just remembering that love is not judging one another. Love has the word compassion. Compassion. We have to be compassionate with one another and have empathy with one another, and allow ourselves not to take on this myth that we have to be perfect, because we can't be, and there's no such thing as perfection. So, just walk in love. Walk in love.
That's one of the huge things that I always run into in this work, is that people think that the pain of making a mistake publicly as a white person is equal to the pain of a Black person living in America. And it's not. And when we equate that pain, real work, real stuff is like showing up and, like, excuse my language, fucking up. Like, this group knows, this body knows. I consider myself a writer, right? I consider myself an author. I consider myself a half-assed Christian mystic, and the Lutheran Church calls me a pastor. The last thing I am is an organizer. But that's how bad it is. We got poets out here getting gassed because folks aren't showing up. So, and to be able to show up in that, to be able to show up and say, hey, look, I don't do a ton of organizing. I do show up in these spaces and lend my voice, but that's about all I do. But here I am put in this very different position because these are the times that we live in. And I think people of faith, I think the story of most faith tradition is some sort of creator stepping into human history to offer salvation to people, which is called collective liberation by most people around the world, and you engaging and being a part of that. Well, that's the only reason I believe in this thing. That's the only reason I get up in the morning. That's the only reason I pray. That's the only reason I do anything. And so to ignore that incarnated word because of, I don't know, polity, or perhaps your church council, or, your board is going to bother you, or what will the neighbors think, or what will my bishop say, or what, any of that, that's all gone now, beloved. What Black people have been trying to tell you for the last 30 years is that the situation has reached critical mass. And it's time. Now is your time. If you want to know what kind of person you'd have been during the civil rights era, you're that person right now.
Mm. Mm.
Do not reimagine yourself that if there was some transcendent leader, you'd be standing there. And if that bothers you, well, there's some work you can do with this community and other communities and the creator to step into that real grounded truth, right? That we all share, that golden thread that runs through all our traditions. Or you can remember that I said this to you. And I hope I'm the black face you think of. I hope I'm the one who delivered that news to you, because there is a time for compassion. You guys are right. Truth without compassion is brutality. But when you're experiencing brutality and you've been screaming from the rooftops of the truth, at some point, you got to hope that people send back a little bit of that love. And I think that's where a lot of people are at in Portland right now. We're desperate for a lifeline. We're desperate for some sort of attention. We're desperate for someone to recenter Black lives here.
Rabbi, did you want to say something?
Oh, I think I just want to say amen at this point. And yeah, I so appreciate.
Well,
yeah,
I'm with you. I want to honor the time that the hour has come and gone, and it's been a really rich conversation. I feel like we could keep talking for at least another hour. I hope you all get a chance to go and look in the comments on the Facebook Live. It's been really, people have been really engaged, and a lot of encouragement there for y'all. I know that you all have been in it. And Lenny, you described that to some degree, but we know that you've all been, just going out and going home and going back out again the next day. And we're just grateful for all of you. I'm almost hesitant to say this at the end because I feel like it's a whole other conversation. But I know from talking to you all earlier, part of the desire for having this conversation beyond the most important piece, which is recentering the story and recentering the focus on the fight for Black lives and justice for Black lives, is how what we have been seeing in Portland is the broader sort of national frame of what I feel like we can expect to see more and more as this particular election comes forward. And I'll just say this, I want to encourage people to go check out a new website called choosedemocracy.us. Some activists, George Lakey among them, are trying to sound the alarm about how what we see happening, this rising fascism that we've touched on and talked about tonight, how we need to stand up and recognize it and take action to prepare, because this country is far from perfect, and we've talked about the white supremacy and the stuff that even our most progressive cities and states have not fully dealt with and fully addressed and fully acknowledged. But there's something bigger at work here, and Portland is part of that. I'll just say a warning sign to the rest of us in this country, and we need to be standing up now about the police violence, the over-policing of our communities, the militarization of our police, etc. And I just want to say thank you again. And is there any other sort of call to action or request or just anything that y'all would want to say before we wrap up here?
I want to say one quick thing. I just want to say that as I was thinking about, what people who aren't in Portland, what can they begin to be doing? if I was going back months before when this whole thing started, I would have began to build relationships across organizations, across communities, across movements, began to have those conversations about how are we going to show up for each other. And I know sometimes it's hard to show up with each other, but to begin to do that relationship building now, because I can see the richness, you know, this BIPOC council that you heard about that we're a part of, we're having this conversation, and it began as a result of this, which is beautiful. And also I like to imagine what it would be like if we would have had some of those spaces before now. What would it look like when it all began for us to be together already and have built that trust and know that we can show up for each other, even as we may have different point of view. So I just want to encourage you all, like, if you're not in Portland, begin to do that as organizers, begin to organize and just show up in different spaces and see it as just like how quickly things are born out of some of those relationships and trust. I just want to leave people with that too.
Amen.
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 Amen. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for your work, and thank everyone out there for watching. And this video is recorded. It will be available. So please do continue sharing it, and take care. God bless.